Hey everybody, it's Mike Schumann of the Daily Hoosier here for another episode of the East 17th Street podcast here on this Tuesday, March 11th. Joined by Seth Tao as almost always. And Seth, we're kind of at this fun point of IU athletics. It's kind of an extravaganza where there's everything going on. We got March Madness coming up. We got a coaching search. You don't usually say those two things at the same time. We got Big Ten tournament coming up this week. IU football spring practice is underway, so a lot to talk about. And I want to start with that first point. I think it's an unusual time and an exciting time for IU basketball fans because you actually have a team that's playing good basketball right now that is also in the middle of a coaching search. I know this has happened before in Indiana circles back in 2006 when it was kind of a similar fact pattern when Mike Davis was let go midseason and the team kind of rallied and played well and played their way into the NCAA tournament. But it's not a common fact pattern throughout college basketball historically. Typically, if there's a mid-season firing, kind of the wheels come off if they already haven't. So an impressive run here for the men's basketball team over the last few weeks. What has stood out to you, Seth, in terms of kind of the underpinnings of them turning around this season the way they have? I feel like it really started at Michigan State a few weeks ago.
Yeah, for sure. Somebody pointed this comparison out online. I don't remember when or who it was, but I'd forgotten about it until they brought it up. Do you remember last year? Just last year, this happened on a smaller scale. Long Beach State had their whole public thing with they fired their coach, but he agreed to stay on through the end of the season. And then they went on a big run to win their conference tournament and get in. And he held that hilarious press conference before their NCAA tournament game, and he was just being real lighthearted about it. And it's not that dissimilar to that situation. Obviously, Indiana's bigger than Long Beach State, but it's not that dissimilar to that situation. I mean, it seems like since it's really, Michigan State has kind of sparked the turnaround. But I mean, the game right before that was Michigan, right? And they, the second half of that Michigan game, the Michigan game was the first game after Indiana and had announced the news about Woodson. And the second, they didn't play that well in that first half against Michigan, but they started to play better in that second half. And it just seemed like, it's hard to say exactly when that moment was when the switch flipped, but it seems like these guys are genuinely playing for Woodson now. They've kind of rallied around the situation. It seems, we've talked about this before, that it seems like everybody's just kind of played like a weight's been lifted off their shoulders with this whole thing a little bit. Woodson has certainly coached, looking that way. He's less concerned about, minute distributions, lineup changes. He's less afraid to kind of tweak things, worrying about, all the domino effects that it could have down the road for future seasons. He's just focused on the here and now. I think that's helped everybody for this team. That has to be helpful to just kind of be able to free your mind a little bit. I've seen plenty of people refute that. Why couldn't they have been playing freely before? And that's why Indiana is in this situation to begin with. But it's been a really remarkable turnaround. They're playing a lot better basketball. They just. A lot of the self-inflicted errors, I feel like that was one of this team's biggest crutches, was just an inability to get out of their own way. Yeah. And they've gotten out of their own way a lot more over the last month or so. They're shooting the ball generally better. They're turning the ball over less. They're giving up less of those quote unquote kill shots, and they're just playing competitively.
Yeah, I would agree. And you could even argue it started before Michigan State. You think back to that Purdue game up in West Lafayette. You and I sat next to each other for that one. And I remember sitting there the whole time just thinking, man, they're playing really well, no matter how this thing goes. Kind of like the women's game against USC the other day. It's like, however this goes, they're playing really well. And like you said, they struggled to finish some games, but it kind of just seemed like once they got over it's like osmosis into my brain. At Michigan State, they realized they could do it, right? They realized they could do it. They could close a game against. Has Michigan State even lost since then? If they have,
it's a great question.
I mean,
that may have been the night that the switch flipped for Michigan State too.
yeah, I think it might have been. Another interesting question: has anybody played zone against Michigan State since then? All kinds of things. I guess if we were a prepared podcast, we would have thought about these things. But no, I mean they closed out that game. I mean, Tom Izzo made Indiana close. They started pressing with like 7-8 minutes to go. They fouled for like 3 straight minutes. Like they made Indiana close that game, and they did it. And it just seems like ever since, and yeah, there's been hiccups since, and they've had some rough moments since, but they've gone 5-2. If you go 5-2 in the Big Ten against, respectable competition for the most part in that stretch, you're playing good basketball, and it begs the question, like what's realistic to expect this week at the Big Ten tournament, and even next week.
I tend to take the mentality like this team. Honestly, it's probably similar to what this team has right now, that I'm not sure I can place expectations on this. I think you kind of have to wash away all expectations, because Indiana right now is the 9 seed in the Big Ten tournament, but they're not playing that ball like a 9 seed.
Yeah.
They just lost to this Oregon team. And look, Indiana didn't have its best game that night, but again, like I tend to think on the whole of everything, it felt more like Oregon went and won that game.
Mm-hmm.
Indiana collapsed over the last few minutes, yes. And, you could nitpick here and there, but like, Jackson Shelstad made that really deep shot and put the really, it felt like Oregon for the most part went and won that game more than Indiana lost that game. And, sometimes you got to tip your hat. And obviously it makes for an interesting circumstance to be playing that team very quickly again. I mean, less than 2 weeks later, you're going to see them, less than 2 weeks later, 2 weeks later, something like that.
Right around there. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So it makes for an interesting circumstance, but look, I think you could make a reasonable case to me that Indiana is going to get bounced by Oregon in the first round here. There's a reason you could make a case that Indiana is going to get to Sunday. Like, I think there's a wide look. Let's be real. Getting to Sunday would be a pretty big surprise still, but like
it would.
But I think it's not out of the realm of possibility. I'm not going to be able to completely write it off the way I may have a month ago. Like, I just think there's a wide range of possibilities for this team.
I mean, look at the top 4 seeds. Michigan State, IU beat them. Maryland, UCLA, and Michigan, all very competitive games right down to the wire. So why shouldn't they at least be thought, as you said, to have a chance to do it? I don't think either one of us would predict they're going to make it to Sunday, but
and I was talking about this with somebody at the women's tournament last week, that going into the IU women playing against USC, like I would feel better about the men's team. Like if they advance and play the top seed, I'd feel better about the men's team going and playing Michigan State.
Oh, yeah.
I feel like both obviously Indiana's already beaten them, but I just feel like the top seeds on the men's side are more gettable than the top seeds on the women's side.
Yeah, Michigan State is not dominant like USC women are on the women's side. It's there's no comparison there. I couldn't have been more impressed sitting there watching the USC women. Just like they had 5 legitimate, skilled, what to my mind WNBA caliber scoring threats on the team, and you had to be like perfect to beat them. Whereas Michigan State, you play zone for a half and you upset them, so it's just not the same. But going back to Oregon on Thursday, and I guess at some point here we'll stop doing the juxtaposition with the women's team. But it's interesting. It's the exact same game of the women last week, 8-9 game against Oregon. And what's interesting about it to me, most of all, is that it's a 9 a.m. game for Oregon. And I wondered last week if that was going to impact the women. And, obviously I don't know, but Oregon got off to a really poor start in that game, so it's legitimate to think that it might have impacted them. It's also a home game for Indiana, quote unquote. Certainly much more partisan crowd than what they had out in Eugene, which I think is a second significant advantage. And just to the point of the game that was recently played in Eugene, Indiana led by a point with less than 2 minutes to go. So if you're Indiana right now, you're thinking, playing in Indianapolis, it's a rough start time for them. We know we're right there with this team. They at least have to go into this game feeling confident that they can get that win.
Yeah, I'm trying to find right now if Oregon has actually played any 9 a.m. local time games this season before, or if this is going to be the first time, because that is a good point. Um, yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I think you can get into the X's and O's of it a little bit of the actual matchup, with Oregon, and how, I mean, it really felt like, to me, watching that game, it felt like everything changed for Indiana when they got Biddle off the floor, when they got Nate
Hmm.
Biddle out of the game, when they got him into a little bit of foul trouble. It felt like everything started to open up more for Indiana, and so I think that's what they're going to have to do in that matchup. Is you got to find ways to, obviously he's all Big Ten defensive team center, and worthy at that. He's probably the best defensive big in the conference this year,
Yep.
and I think you got to be careful about the way you attack him because of that. But I think you got to find a way to get him off the floor and create your opportunities that way, because with the way Indiana is set up to play, I think it's a tough matchup for Indiana to go up against a strong defensive big like Nate Biddle.
Yeah, I kind of felt like in that first game, him and Bao kind of neutralized each other a little bit. I was nervous going into that game about Balo's ability to guard Biddle out on the perimeter because he does shoot a little bit, but that wasn't too much of a factor. I mean, it could just come down to look, both these teams, have shooters, but they're not consistent. So who's making shots in this game, I think could ultimately come down to it. It's certainly a factor for Indiana in every game. They're not typically, other than against Ohio State the other day, not typically a team that's going to win a lot of games unless they're hitting threes. Um, I want to go back to just the notion though of Indiana playing better lately, and the reason for that. If we were in a situation here where we could talk to the coach on a regular basis, talk to the players on a regular basis, we might be able to develop this story a little bit, because one of the most intriguing things to me going back to the second Purdue game is the way Miles Rice has played off the bench, and specifically the way he has played defense. I feel like I know Braden Smith just won Big Ten Player of the Year, but Miles Rice to me was the best point guard on the court that day. He completely flustered and shut down Smith, especially in the second half. And, him along with Malik Renew coming off the bench, I think is an interesting dynamic, because those are two guys that are, both were all conference to some degree last year. Renew again this year with honorable mention, coming off the bench. So their matchups are typically coming against bench players. And both of them have, shown that they're not hanging their head about, the situation. I think Renew has been excellent going back to the Michigan State game. Rice has been excellent since that Purdue game. And especially Rice, because, I think you and I and a whole lot of other people were not down on him, but stating the obvious that he was not playing well in clutch situations, making poor decisions. And I think his defense again on Saturday against Bruce Thornton when he came in, I think it's really been a difference maker for this team.
Yeah, quickly going back to the earlier point about the AM start times for Oregon, because I found it. They've had two prior games, but that would have started before noon on the West Coast, and the results are mixed. They had the first time they did it was at Michigan State on February 8th, and if you recall, Oregon was winning for a lot of that game, like into the second half, and then Michigan State, I think, kind of pulled away in the second half of the second half, like the fourth quarter of the game, so to speak. And Michigan State won that by 12. The other time they did that was at Wisconsin a couple weeks ago, and Oregon made a huge comeback in that game. They were down double digits for a while, and Oregon made a huge comeback and won that
I
game in
remember that.
overtime.
I
So,
remember being stunned
yeah,
by that score. I
yeah,
guess what you're telling me right now is it doesn't mean anything.
probably not.
Because they were good in the first half against Michigan State and good in the second half against Wisconsin. So
It's the sort of thing that I think could be impactful if there was, 3 days between, 2 days between games, like 3 days between games, or kind of a quicker turnaround. But I mean, Oregon's last game of the season was Sunday, and they're not playing. I mean, I guess that is 3 games, 3 days between games, but if it was like a 1 day, but 2 games in 3 days, 2 games in 4 days, I feel like, maybe that would be, to where you're kind of not having much time to
Yeah.
adjust to the time. Like, I think Oregon should have plenty of time to adjust their body clocks to be up for that game.
I'd be curious to know when they came to
Yeah.
Indianapolis. I thought it was really smart when Indiana went out to Seattle a day earlier than they normally would for a road trip. I think that probably helped them in the long run with that acclimation process. But your reactions to what I was saying about Rice.
Yeah. I mean, with Rice, it's just, he's just been, that when Miles Rice is on his game, he's really impactful. It's just, he's been really inconsistent this whole season. And it's, for me with him, it's just, I think it makes sense to have more sense to have him come off the bench for Indiana right now, just kind of because of that, because it depends so much on what version of Miles Rice is showing up for you today. And if it's the really impactful, score, using his speed for good, not evil, and making smart decisions and being a locked in defender, like that's a guy, then, you don't have any problem putting that guy on the floor in crunch time when the minutes might matter a little more. But if you have a guy, the Miles Rice that's just not really into the game, is taking some bad shots, is trying to play hero ball a little too much, and is just kind of being a little you can be selfish in a good way or you can be selfish in a bad way. And I'm not
Right.
trying to imply that that's what Rice is definitely doing here, but you know, you can when Rice is playing a little more selfishly, sometimes that's going bad. And, and when you have that guy on the floor at the beginning of the game, sometimes it's like you're playing 4-on-5 out there, and that's how you get into a really big early hole. And I don't know that this Indiana team is really, they can play from behind, but and while they've been a second half team quite a bit, there a lot of those early season losses, had strong second half efforts, but it was just they dug themselves too deep of a hole to where it wouldn't even matter anymore. And you can't have that. This team is not built for the double digit comebacks all the time. Like, this team, you can't get yourself in that early hole. So it makes sense to have Rice coming off the bench, just so maybe you can ease him into the game a little more. You can ease the whole team into the game a little more, and then see which version of Rice you have.
And they've only been able to do that because the trio of Galloway, Goody, and Leal have been really good lately. It's been it's been impressive to watch. I really thought Leo might get some level of Big Ten all defensive team recognition. I suspect he didn't because he only started the last 13 games and didn't play a lot of minutes before that. But, to the extent you want to put merit in Bart Torvik's stats, specifically his defensive box score plus minus, Leo was number one in the Big Ten. He's only played 40% of Indiana's minutes. So sample size is a little bit small, but still incredibly impressive. And the most impressive thing about it to me was it was the best plus minus on the defensive end for an Indiana player since Victor Oladipo's 2013 season. And he won Defensive Player of the Year that year for Big Ten and some national recognition in that regard. So defense is hard to measure at times. We tend to just look at stocks, blocks, or steals and blocks, but there's just a lot that goes into that. And I think more than anything, he's just kind of become that gritty guy that the other teams hate and is always kind of getting in their head. And you saw that a little bit on Saturday with John Mobley. I said at the time I didn't think it was going to rise to the level of a flagrant because I think Leo was kind of the instigator, but that's just the kind of stuff that those kind of guys get to happen in games. And that was a key moment in the game. It kind of flipped the whole mood in the building.
Yeah, yeah. And with the all defensive team, I mean, whether you like to admit it or not, the people that vote on something like that, like the all defensive team, a lot of them are going to look at offensive stats too when they're
Yeah.
factoring in some guys like that. And there's a chance that, obviously Leal is not a big offensive threat. I don't know the exact number, he scores points per game, but I mean, you look at the guys that were all on that team, and pretty much all of them are like better contributors offensively
Yeah.
than Anthony Leal. And not that should be the differentiator in an all defensive team award, but the reality is people that vote on this on that stuff may factor that in, and that could have been working against Anthony Leal there too. But you're right. I mean, I wrote it. I can't remember after which game I wrote it for, but maybe after the Purdue game. But yeah, I wrote it after a few games ago during the streak that, I mean, he's become kind of the glue guy, and you're right, kind of the instigator. Just he's the guy that clearly, I mean, he's the clear fan favorite of the team.
Yep.
He's the guy that seems to understand. Not that nobody else on this roster understands like kind of the pulse of the fan base, but it feels like he really, I mean, as he should. The guy grew up in Bloomington, grew up all around IU basketball his whole life. Like, he's a guy who clearly understands the power of the program, the way the fan base is reacting to everything, and just, the position that he's in, both, like I said, growing up in Bloomington, but also putting in his time throughout his career to get to this point, not playing a ton up until really, starting to a little bit more last year. And really the second half of this year is when he really started getting consistently high minutes. So, yeah, he's become such an integral player to this team, even if the stats don't and accolades don't reflect it.
I don't want to completely dominate this episode with the men's basketball team, but I do want to talk about the NCAA tournament. I think right now, bracket matrix, if I checked right this morning or remembering right this morning, 105 of 108 brackets had Indiana in. My sense, it could come down to bid stealers that could change this, the number of bid stealers, but my rough sense is that Indiana's really not playing to get in at this point. They're playing to stay out of the first four is my best guess as to what's going on right now. Fans will remember what 2022 was like, playing in Dayton at 9:00 on a Tuesday night and having to take an overnight flight to Portland, Oregon to play again on Thursday. I can tell everyone that was miserable for me personally. I think I slept through the press conference the next day because I finally got to sleep and couldn't wake up. And the players had to turn around the next day and play a game. So there is a lot to try to avoid there. I don't know if the NCAA is doing any better job of keeping guys in the same time zone after the first four. I suspect not. I've not heard anything about that if they are. But Indiana seems to be right there on that line. I think the last I saw from Lenardi is that they were the last team to get a bye in his projection. I suspect most people are in that rough neighborhood. So a win at Oregon seems to play them out of the first four. Is that generally kind of what you're thinking, seeing, feeling about where they're at with this thing?
I mean, right now, based on the bracket matrix, they would still be in the first four. They look like the third team. They're the last four at-large teams in the bracket matrix here have It's Ohio State currently, Ohio State and Xavier on the 12 line, and then Oklahoma and Indiana on the 11 line. So, there's Dayton is still very much a possibility. And look, I think it's hard to say, oh, they're definitely in, because look, if you, and it definitely in as far as not large, I should say. Right. Obviously, like we said, the bid stealers, Indiana needs to be rooting for all the favorites right now in the mid-major tournaments, and really just all of the tournaments. I mean, it would be bad news for Indiana if, like, say Iowa goes and makes a huge run and wins the Big Ten tournament. Like, that would be bad news for Indiana.
Although it would be bad if they beat Ohio State.
Yeah, you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah, but I look, if they, and this is something that we talked about more early in the season, as far as how you look in a loss or how you look in a win. But like, if you go out there and get clobbered by Oregon, if Oregon goes out and lays the hammer down and wins that game by 30 in Indianapolis, that could spell trouble for Indiana.
Yeah, that would be a problem.
I would be surprised if that happens, given the way that this team has been playing the last month. But, if that was to happen, then no, I would not say that this team is safely in by any means. But if they go out and lose a competitive game to Oregon, they should be fine. If they go out and win, I don't know that necessarily going out and winning puts them out of Dayton. Like, you might need to beat Michigan State. You might need to have some other results go your way, and with other bubble teams or other, obviously the bid stealers, going your way would help there too. But I don't know that there's a lot of certainty with this. Everybody I feel like is going to want to make this Oregon game into, you win this game and this happens. And I just don't know that I'm at the point where I can say that with really anything. Like, yeah, if Indiana goes out and on the other hand, goes out and beats Oregon by 30, 40, goes out and dominates Oregon, then yeah, maybe I would at that point go out and say, okay, this is a team that should have a bye and should not be in Dayton. But I think it's not as black and white as I feel like a lot of people want to make it out to be.
Yeah, and I think people can look back to 22. I know I was one that was guilty of thinking they were nowhere near the first four. I thought they were, at least 4 teams above the first four, and they ended up there. So, we spend so much time on these predictions, and it only matters what the people in the room think. And we were pretty far off 3 years ago and could go either direction this time too.
Yeah. And you got to remember also just the process of how the bracket gets put together, that they're really already, I don't know the exact dates of everything, but the committee is going to be meeting as the Big Ten tournament is happening.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, obviously the results are going to impact some things, but just remember, in 2022, like you were talking about, the Big Ten championship game is pretty much right before the bracket is revealed. And so when you have that sort of situation and does it hurt teams that play on Sunday, play their title games on Sunday versus Saturday? It's hard to say. This isn't me kind of making that case, but it is important to remember that it's not just it's not like they all get in a room at once, an hour before, right after the Big Ten championship game and just slap it all together. Like, this is all happening in real time. So, conference tournament results might not matter as much as people want them to, but in some cases, maybe they matter quite a bit more than people want them to. It's just, you got to remember that it's a whole process of the bracket getting put together. So, that's another reason for why the nature of the game against Oregon might matter, because that's earlier in the tournament. And, even though Oregon's not, this dominant, they're the 8 seed in the Big Ten, they're probably looking at like a 6 seed, 5 seed, something like that in March Madness. Like, they're not like world beaters by any means, but, this is more of a chance for them to show off, the way they're playing basketball, as opposed to some later on in the tournament when it really just might be the result of the game that gets factored in.
Yeah. And they've been playing really well lately too. This is the time of year when conspiracies about, the brackets start coming up, like, oh, they're going to try to schedule this game or that game. You see teams like North Carolina and Arkansas kind of in roughly the same situation as Indiana. I have no doubt that at least television people would love to get an IU North Carolina or IU Arkansas game in the first four to draw a lot more eyeballs to that particular setting. I don't know if I believe the conspiracies, but yeah.
Really, there's so many matchups like that. You could conjure up with teams on the bubble. You could get the Archie Miller Bowl, Indiana against Xavier. You could get the Kelvin Sampson Bowl, Indiana, Oklahoma.
You mean Houston?
Well, yeah, but that's the connection.
Yeah. Oh, I got you. Yeah, there was I think when Indiana played Miami a couple of years ago, they were going to play Houston and Sampson in Kansas City in the Sweet 16 if they advanced, but that didn't happen. You're right; those things are always there. Anything else you want to talk about with the current season and the upcoming tournament or tournaments?
No, I think everybody should just kind of enjoy the run that this team is on, because it feels like it's been such a weird season for the men's team this year, and it honestly felt like everybody proclaimed them dead, us included. And there was every reason to proclaim them dead in January, end of January, beginning of February, kind of right before this run started. And now it kind of feels like they're every fan might feel differently. And obviously there were expectations coming into the season, but it now kind of feels like they're playing the sort of basketball and playing and winning games like there's not, it kind of feels like they're outperforming what's now become the expectation for them and just kind of winning without expectations. And to me, that's always the most pure feeling as a sports fan, is when
Yeah,
you're
for sure.
kind of when you're winning games and you're kind of, it feels like you're playing with house money a little bit. Like that's always the best feeling as a sports fan to me. And so I guess I'd tell everybody to just kind of enjoy this run. Don't get caught up too much in the results, the wins and the losses, because this team's been playing some really fun basketball the last month. And the fact that they're going to play in March Madness at all is a testament to that.
Yeah, and what I've been telling people is like, look, it's kind of the best of both worlds. You wanted a new coach, you're going to get one, and you still, you're still probably going to have a situation where you win 6 games and you're a national champion, which is kind of like that house money scenario you're talking about. Not predicting that, but it's always fun to think all you have to do is go on a 6-game winning streak and you're national champions. But
and to the people that are using this as second guessing, whether Woodson should stay or not, I don't agree with that, because I think, like we talked about at the top, the vibe around this team has clearly changed, and they've played very, with Woodson included, just everything has been different with Woodson and his team since they announced, since his future kind of became clear. And I think it's been a great run for this team, but if you put Woodson back in place next season after all this, just because he turned it around when he wasn't feeling that pressure, I think could be a really costly mistake.
yeah, I mean, to that point, if you had told me Rice and Renew would be coming off the bench in March, I would have told you were nuts when the season started. So, a lot has changed, and that segues perfectly into coming change in the coaching search, which has kind of gone, what I would say, pretty much silent. We had a lot of excitement when it first came out in terms of Brad Stevens was the hot topic, and I think legitimately so. I think he was the top guy on Indiana's board based on my own opinion and understanding of the situation. And I think Dusty May was number 2, so that created a lot of buzz early on because both those guys seem to have come and gone off the board. Certainly, in my opinion, May is 100% off. I don't see any reason why he would raise the cost for Indiana to buy out his contract. That just seems silly to me. I do think it's strange that he went ahead and renegotiated in the middle of the season, although I don't know how significant that ultimately is. But since those 2 guys have come off the board, I felt like the search is just kind of flattened out. And there's a lot of guys, the national guys will say, oh, it's TJ Otzelberger's the guy to consider. We've heard Scott Drew. There was some buzz last week about Chris Beard, which I thought was ridiculous. But I think we're at a point where, Scott Dolson's inner circle is pretty tight. I think, they're conducting a search with a search firm, but I think that's more like background checks and maybe some high level vetting. I think the thing that people need to understand is like everybody gets vetted. The first thing I published when the news came out was like, okay, just puke out every name I can think of that might be on Scott Dolson's radar. I think the search firm at some level has taken a look at just about all those people. It may not be like, oh yeah, we're going to interview this guy and do an extensive background check, but I think there's some degree of looking at all those people. So when you hear like, oh, I use, maybe carefully going to start considering Chris Beard, I think that's what that stuff is. It's just like agents getting the information out or, I don't think anything's coming from the actual Scott Dolson circle is what I'm trying to say. And I would caution people when this stuff starts to pop out from time to time. I think you saw it pretty well with Beard over the weekend. Jeff Goodman posted something on Twitter about Beard, and like an hour later, he walked it back, which to me was like somebody was telling him like, you probably want to walk that one back. and I think that's just going to continue until they're ready. Because I mean, you think back to the Kurt Signetti search. Nobody was saying until it came out right at the end that Signetti was the guy. Nobody was saying Mike Woodson until I think Rick Bozich posted it on Twitter. And nobody was talking about Woodson before that as a serious candidate. So I suspect that's where we're going to end up. Is it one of the mainline guys that everybody's talking about? like a McCollum or a Brownell or, name your guy. I'm not sure about that. What I'm struggling with right now is if it's not one of those guys, which everybody kind of has um, a shrug reaction to, not super excited. I don't know who at this point would be like the energizer to the fan base.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with pretty much everything you're saying. It's hard to see which way this is going. It's definitely gone quieter, and I think that's just kind of naturally because a lot of the big quote unquote big name, the top guys right off the bat, clearly seem to be out. I mean, it makes sense to me why Dusty May went ahead and did this during the season. It seems like he just wanted to do that to take the distraction away from his own team up in Michigan this year, and clearly it was becoming a distraction. So, it's hard to say where this is going to end up. And I've been saying from the beginning that I don't know that there's any candidate out there that was going to be 100% approval rating right off the bat from the IU fan base. I think even Brad Stevens, like even Dusty May, like the reported top candidates, the dream wish list, whatever you want to call it, there were, potential drawbacks to even those guys. And so I think people are going to overreact regardless, I think, to whatever happens. Is it possible they end up with, more of an unproven mid-major kind of coach? Yeah, sure. Just you got to keep in mind how other coaching searches at this level have gone over the last several years. I mean, look at Kentucky last year, and it was kind of a similar thing that happened. And obviously they landed on Mark Pope, and he's done a nice job down in Lexington this year. And, that's just how this is going to play out. And I think people are going to, there's nothing I can say that's going to calm people down. And I, I know that. And every day is just going to, there's going to be a lot of speculation and just all the noise and everything. And people, are going to be really excited about one little leak and be really mad about one little leak. And to me, I'm just like, let's breathe and let everything play out, and then maybe react to, is this good? Is this bad? This is how this is going to look, all of that sort of thing. And I think there's still plenty of names that, we haven't written about, we haven't discussed, that are probably on the radar. And there's probably guys that we haven't even heard of that are on the radar. So like just, there's still a long period before, and look, like the NCAA tournament starts, the, more candidates become available, and, you get into April and the portal opening, and you obviously want to get something in place quickly, but the next few weeks are going to feel like an eternity in the basketball world. So it's going to feel like there's still a long time before, a long period before anything like is going to come together coach wise. And, people might wonder what were they doing during this extra time that they had, after they announced it. And we said that at the beginning, that a lot of this was just kind of going to be getting their ducks in a row internally. And so, here we are. And, you can't just use a magic potion on the coach you want to get him to come. And, so, you go and you find the best candidate. And I think it's more than likely that Indiana is going to end up at this point taking, they're going to take a chance on somebody in one way or another. And I mean, just the perfect candidate who's won national titles and is born in small town Indiana and his dreams of being Bob Knight, like that guy isn't walking through the door necessarily. So, you just gotta work with what you got, and there's plenty of options out there, and we'll see where it goes.
I don't want to get too into the weeds on particular candidates, but I think one of the more intriguing guys that I don't think we've talked about in depth on this forum anyway is Ben McCollum. And I think he's one of the more divisive guys amongst the fan base. I talk to people that would be thrilled to have him. And I talk to people that are, are you crazy to even consider him? I think a lot of people are scorned or scarred by the Archie Miller era. I don't know that comparison is too valid. I mean, honestly, McCollum's more unproven, at least at the D1 level, than Miller. But I think at some point you just got to chalk up Archie Miller to being a bad hire. He's proven that at Rhode Island, whatever his merits were at Dayton. A lot of people went at Dayton, so I'm not sure that was ultimately the convincing aspect of it. But there's also a lot of really good major hires that Indiana fans would love to have right now, like a Nate Oates or a Todd Golden. The I detailed out today where all of the top coaches came from, and not the majority, but I think like 12 out of 32, which was the most of any path, came from mid-major. So
You saying like the top coaches in the country?
yeah, like if you look
Okay.
at the Kim Pom top 30, I think I did, 12 of them came from mid-major, including like Oates and Golden and Otzelberger. So, you kind of got to let the Archie Miller thing go. It was a bad hire, but it doesn't mean that you can't make a good hire from mid-major. But McCollum is
Not to mention that when Indiana hired Tom Crean, Marquette was still in what, CUSA? Like that
think so.
was like that's a mid-major hire that, I mean, obviously, you can, get into a debate about how that whole era ended, but on the whole, Indiana had success during that era. Like I would not call that an unsuccessful hire from a
Yeah, I mean,
mid-major.
occasionally see people saying, "Well, let's just bring Tom Crean back," but
That's not what I'm saying, but that was not the point of that comment.
But what about McCollum? He's such a unique candidate. I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like it. I'd have to go back and look at like what Bo Ryan did at D2. He might be the closest thing, but 4 D2 titles in 6 years, and I think one of those 6 years was the COVID year where the season was canceled. And then now he's got Drake. I think does Drake already won 30 games? That they're right there. They're in the NCAA tournament. They're great, and most of his players. I don't think people realize this are the players from his D2 team last year. They transferred with him, so it's an incredible story. The question that everybody has with him is, will it translate? Like, how much of coaching is X's and O's? How much of it is recruiting, and how much of it is just like I think the fishbowl thing is completely overblown, but how much of does that matter for a guy like him who's been kind of able to operate at a high level in the shadows? I mean, I don't know. I don't have a good answer.
I mean, the comparison that you're trying to draw as to what Indiana might be looking at, to me, it's easy to see, what, the people that are advocates of Ben McCollum, it's easy to see their line of thinking. It's look at what Kurt Signetti did across the street from Assembly Hall
Yeah.
and look at his background. Let's get a guy like that.
Yeah.
And, McCollum is pretty much the best fit for that profile, not specifically everything about Signetti, but in terms of just his resume, his background in the game, and the position he's in right now as a potential candidate. Like that is what the Ben McCollum advocates are thinking. And I mean, to a certain extent, it's hard to blame them with the way football just with the season that football just had. It's hard to blame them for let's get that for basketball. Like, yeah, if they can make that work, then sure. But obviously, it's more complicated than that. You're right. I think it's kind of a divisive candidate. I've said all along that I probably put more stock into the fishbowl aspect of things than you might, and just the way. I mean, and you talk about Archie Miller being a bad hire. It seemed. I mean, I don't know that he handled the fishbowl aspect of Indiana very well himself, and that may have been part of his undoing, honestly. So I think I always put a little bit not over. I don't overvalue that, but I don't undervalue that. I think that's important at a job like Indiana. You got to know what you're getting yourself into here, because this isn't just some, the difference between if it was a big step up for McCollum going from Division II to Drake, it would be just as big of a step up going from Drake to Indiana. Like just the amount of spotlight that would be on him at all times would be massive. So I do, it's hard for me to sit here and say, oh, he's a great candidate, he's a bad candidate. Like, I mean, I think he's certainly a worthy candidate. I'll put that. But, is he the right candidate? It's hard to say. But I think that's the best way to put it. He's a worthy candidate.
I think it would be a diametric shift for Indiana fans. I think what if you hired McCollum, I think what you're trying to do is to follow the Purdue, Wisconsin, get 3 stars, build a culture, um, you know, play a certain playing style that's kind of clearly identifiable. It's not, you know, big game hunting for 5 stars and that whole being crazy in the transfer portal every year. I think you're trying to follow a path that quite frankly is very proven in the Big Ten
Exactly.
to be successful. So I don't think it's a crazy thing to think that McCollum could get a bunch of high end 3 stars and be very successful in the Big Ten.
Yeah. I mean, I was gonna say, as you're outlining that, I'm like, that's exactly what a winning program should be doing. I mean,
Yeah.
not that going out and getting 5 stars and trying to land a 5 star type talent, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But I mean, the culture and the system and establishing yourself and not just trying to be a 5 star chameleon. Like, there's very few programs and coaches that can pull that off, like Coach K would back in the day. Like,
Right.
There's only so many Mike Krzyzewskis in the world, and I think whether or not you're getting 5 stars or 3 stars, doing all that other stuff you were talking about, that's what Indiana needs to find in this next coach, regardless of how many of the recruiting rankings. Which, I mean, funny enough, is kind of the same mentality that Signetti has with football, like that the stars don't matter, production over potential, all that
Yeah.
sort of stuff. Like, that's kind of the same mentality that he takes.
Yeah. And just to cap off that point, I think Izzo just won the Big Ten Coach of the Year, and he's not too far from that same type of thing. I was watching his interview on the Big Ten Network today, and he was talking about, players still want to be coached. They still want discipline. And I think there's still a place for that. So I don't get too hung up on, oh, it's the NIL era and, you got to be different. No, you can just find players that fit what you want to do and be very successful is how I would leave it. So we'll continue to cover this. I do expect things to pick up here in the next couple of weeks as teams come off the board in terms of, their seasons coming to an end. Most of the coaching activity happens, middle part of March through the end of the month. So I think things will ramp up here considerably. Wanted to flip the switch to the IU women, though. I think they had a really nice finish to their regular season. I think they had a really strong showing at the Big Ten tournament. What's your latest thinking in terms of the seed line that they'll probably end up on when that gets announced on Sunday evening?
Well, there's less bracketology and projections like that with the women than there are with the men. So, when I look at the bracket matrix on the men's side, I can feel like I've got a decent idea of, because it's just a composite of over 100 or however many it is brackets and bracketologists that submit into that thing. Getting the composite of all of those people's thinking makes me feel like, dang it, makes me feel like I've got a pretty good idea.
I've seen that happen at a press conference recently.
Yeah, I know. It fell off of like the ledge at the game at Minnesota last year, and it's been screwed up ever since then. But that's neither here nor there. Yeah, so I don't get. It's hard to kind of get that same level of assuredness, I think, when you're looking at women's projections. What I will say, for the ESPN women's bracketology, I mean, it's had them at a 10 seed for a little bit now. It feels pretty solid, like they're going to end up on that 10 line. 10 line, maybe they're an 11. Maybe they get stuck in the first 4. Maybe, it's hard to say. It feels more like, somewhere around that range. Maybe they get bumped up to a 9 if they really love the Big Ten, but 10 or 11 is probably what they're looking at.
And I know you've done some looking at the different potential host sites. What would be some good ones for Indiana in terms of maybe not having to travel too far, maybe having some local fans be able to go to games?
Yeah, I mean, in that aspect, you're hoping to end up in South Bend at Notre Dame. If Indiana wound up as a 10 seed and Notre Dame is a 2 seed, and both of those things are very, Notre Dame on ESPN is on the 2 line. So that is possible. I mean, the women did play up at Notre Dame in 2015 or no, 2016, excuse me. I think it was Terry Morin's second year. They played up at Notre Dame in the tournament. So they've done that before. It could happen again, maybe. That's probably the one you're hoping for. I think Kentucky is slated to host as well. They're kind of, at least in position to maybe host. They're looking at, at least based on ESPN, they're looking at a 3 seed. So if you wanted them to be down in Lexington, you would be hoping that Indiana got an 11 seed, and maybe that means in the play-in game. What was interesting to me as I was going through all this the host sites is that Kentucky women could be hosting, and there's Lexington is a men's tournament site too. How funny would that be if both teams somehow wound up in Lexington?
Yeah, that's very interesting.
That'll be convenient. That would be convenient.
Yeah. that means their men are going to be in Wichita and the women are going to be like in Los Angeles or something.
Yeah, but those are the two host sites that seem plausible as far as being close for travel. I mean, I guess Ohio State is lingering around. Ohio State is a 4 seed too, but it's and like we've talked about this, but too, I don't know how much it used to be that they would try so hard to avoid conference matchups earlier in the bracket. I don't know if that's still a thing now, if because of how big the conferences have gotten, 18 team conference, is that still, if that's not as big of a thing, then, that could be an option. But also with Ohio State probably not moving up to the 3 line, it's hard to see that happening, because if it was a 4 seed, Indiana would need to fall to a 12, and that seems unlikely. So realistically, to answer your question, it's probably you're hoping for an 11 seed. If they're an 11 seed, you would want them in Lexington. If they're a 10 seed, you would want them in South Bend.
And are you aware, is there like any attempt by the committee to regionalize things? Like would they break a tie by sending Indiana to a Notre Dame or Lexington, or are they just kind of agnostic about that?
I mean, I don't know anything for sure. I would guess probably not, because I would guess probably not, because I mean, the advantage is given to like the top 4 seeds here by hosting to begin with, and you're not, maybe you toggle with it a little bit if possible, if it's not creating that much of a disadvantage. But certainly, I mean, if they see Indiana as like the top 10 seed and Notre Dame as the top 2 seed, I don't know that you'd be putting Indiana and South Bend just to get that kind of proximity and create a potential unfair disadvantage to Notre Dame.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, I mentioned earlier, I thought, even though they lost against USC, I couldn't have been more impressed with the way Indiana competed in that game. They just had that look of that, that pesky underdog that wasn't going to go away. And, I thought until the very end, they might find a way to pull that thing out against who I think is, one of the top 4 or 5 teams in the country pretty clearly. Do you see a team that, if they get the right draw, can advance into the second week of the tournament?
Maybe. I mean, look,
that's not convincing.
It's hard to say, because I mean, like, I'm not disagreeing with anything you say about the USC performance. They looked solid at that point. There's a lot of people that are out there that want to make the point that, oh, this is a team that's gelling at the right time. They played a solid game against Oregon. They, competed against USC. But it's not like that's, they competed, they played USC close back in January. True. They played UCLA pretty tight earlier in January. Like, they've played tough teams, well. They've competed against some of these good teams, kind of throughout the season. But it's just been the inconsistency to me that's been really troubling with this team, is that it's just hard to know, what you have on one night may not carry over to the next. And it's been a lot of kind of recurring issues and things like that just kind of, whether even if it's not the same thing every single night, you can kind of take your pick of 3 or 4 different things that have kind of plagued this team all season long. 1 or 2 of them feel like they've been haunting this team most games this season. Yeah. And it's just, it makes it, if everything is kind of clicking and you get the right matchup, yeah, sure. I mean, this is a veteran team that's been to the tournament before, especially if you go up against maybe a more green team when it comes to tournament experience. Like that could matter in some sense. A team that's not going to lose their heads under the bright lights. But you got to keep in mind also that this is a team that has not performed well away from Indiana for a lot of the season.
Yeah.
I mean, they did just go up to Indy and play well, but I mean, and those were not super, well attended games by any means, but like they were basically home games for
Right.
Indiana. Like,
Especially
and
given that their
right,
opponents were both West Coast teams.
right. So those are basically home games, and this is a team that their one big road win this season was at Iowa, and Iowa is currently not a tournament team. So like this is just a team that has not really, and Indiana's going to probably end up in like a neutral site game basically for round one. And, that would depend on, the proximity of that and whoever, for Indiana and for whoever you're playing against, but it's basically a neutral site game. And then if they win, in all likelihood, it's a true road game. And
right.
This is a team that has struggled with that this year. They kind of have not had the mentality you would expect from a veteran team, playing with the pressure of a road game. And so I do have my doubts that they're a second weekend team this year. I think they have the talent to do so. I think if everything is kind of clicking, they could maybe surprise some people. And it's not like this would be an Indiana, it's not like it would be a surprise for women's basketball fans based on the last however many years to see Indiana, make a run in the tournament. But the way that, having watched this team's entire season, I think I would be surprised if and I'll to kind of go back to, the juxtaposition between the two programs. And it's crazy to think that I'm saying this right now. I would feel better. I feel like I'd feel more confident in a potential Sweet 16 run for the men's team than the women's team.
Yeah, I can see that because of your point that the second game for the women's going to be basically a road game. I guess one of the things that got me a little bit more confident in the women of being potentially able to go on a little run here, and you can tell me since you've in depth followed the season, like Yarden Garzone, those two games in Indianapolis, I thought I could not have been more impressed. Like I know she's always been a good shooter, but she wasn't just making shots. She was like, making clutch shots at key moments. She was scoring in a number of different ways. It just wasn't making threes. Did her performance in those two games stand out to you, or was that just me following it as closely as I have? And, there wasn't any outlier thing there. Cause I think if she keeps playing at that level, she's going to make it hard to knock Indiana out.
Yeah. I mean, she was awesome in those two games. And that's a level that we've seen her reach, throughout her IU career, really. Like when she's been one of the best shooters in the country for the, ever since she stepped on campus here. And when she gets into a rhythm and gets hot, she's hard to stop. And she's definitely added to her game over the last couple of years. But the problem with Garzone, and she's, looking at it, pulling up her game by game, she's definitely been better, I would say, the last 5 games of the regular season. And then, she scored in double figures the last 5 games of the regular season and both games in Indy. So that's now 7 straight games in double figures for her, and including a double-double in that Ohio State game. But her problem is just, it's been inconsistency, I think. It's when the shots aren't falling for Garzone, she's definitely the type to try to shoot her way out of a slump. And as a coach, that's probably what you want your shooters to try to do, because you don't want them to lose confidence in their shot. You want them to keep putting it up, because over time, the law of large numbers, like it's gonna work itself out,
right?
Because that she's a near 40% shooter for her career. You can feel confident in that. But when the shots aren't falling and she's cold, it can quickly become a problem where she's just, 1 for 8 or 1 for 9 from 3-point range, and she starts settling for bad shots. And then it also, she can become a defensive liability pretty quickly too. I think it's been tough, I think, for Indiana to kind of find the right spot for her defensively, because of that, because they have her playing the 4 or the 3 at times, and sometimes the 5, and it's just she's probably not like a natural fit at any of those spots. I don't know that she's a natural defensive fit at any spot on the floor right now. There's pros and cons to her at all 3 of those spots on the floor defensively, and especially if she's going up against a quicker big, she can become a liability really quickly. And it just feels like it's just been kind of the story of the whole team. It's just been inconsistent for Garzone. And like I said, maybe she's turned a corner the last however many games it's been, last 5 games. She's played better and gotten to rolling more, and maybe she's just locked in for the end of the season now for this last ride down the stretch. But I don't know that what I saw in Indy was necessarily an outlier from what I know she can do, because I know she can do that, and she's had games like that this season. She's had bigger games than that this season, to be honest. But I mean, especially in that third quarter, that second half, she was really, really good. And yeah, I don't disagree with you that if they get that version of Yarden in the tournament, yeah, I think they could make a top team sweat.
So both selection shows are Sunday evening. We'll, of course, have coverage of both announcements as they happen. I'm thinking maybe even a special episode of this podcast at some point Sunday evening, just to talk about the draws for both teams. So stay tuned for all of that. Last thing I want to cover briefly, spring football practice started. We both went on Saturday. Did you go today as well?
I was not at the practice portion today. I was at the press conference. Yeah.
And for people that don't know, they do let media go to small portions of some of the practices, roughly 20 minutes, half hour. It's not like you're getting to see them, implement their offense and a lot of 11-on-11 type stuff. So
it's mostly warm-ups.
Yeah. Good photo ops for us.
Right.
That's pretty much it. Maybe shake some hands, that sort of thing. But so, watching one practice, talking to Signetti on Saturday, any initial high-level thoughts, reactions, things standing out? Not so much.
It's really hard to draw much from one kind of warm-up session, and just so it's not like Signetti said anything really earth-shattering. I mean, it was interesting to me that they've added Justice Ellison to the coaching staff as a GA, but I mean, I didn't even, to illustrate, like, the portions of practice we're able to see, like, somebody else noticed that and asked the question. I didn't even spot Ellison out there. So like that was news to me when that question was asked. So there's only so much you can say. I mean, everybody's kind of raving about how Fernando Mendoza has looked. Elijah Surratt had some good things to say about him today, but it's, what do you expect them to say right now? Like,
everybody looks good in practice. Right?
Everybody comes in the best shape of their life, and it's everybody's on the cusp of a breakout year, and one day at a time. Got to be better today than you were yesterday, etc. Like, all that's all you're really going to get this time of year. And I think it's interesting. Here talking to the players today was interesting to me. Like, kind of coming for them to come in this year. It's not often that Indiana comes in to spring after having any sort of expectations for the coming off the season they had, and it's just kind of interesting to hear the veterans talk about needing to give a little reality check in some ways to some of the younger players coming in, thinking that they're joining a CFP level program. And it's, they just got to remind everybody that everybody in the country is 0-0 right now. So there's no real high level stuff to take away at this point, but I would also probably say there's not much high level stuff to take away after the spring game. So,
No, I would agree. I mean, I think back to some of the things we saw last year during the spring game, and I think some of it held up. I remember you saying you were impressed with the running backs, and I think that kind of held to be true. But I think we were also kind of thinking maybe Taven Jackson looked a little bit better than Curtis Rourke, and that didn't. And Signetti's even acknowledged that, like his new quarterbacks, tend to take some time before they look comfortable. So I think it's real easy to overread some of this stuff. One thing that I think will be really interesting is the attendance at the spring game. Last year I think it was okay. It exceeded my expectations, but some college programs around the country will sell out their stadiums or darn close to it for spring games. I'm not expecting that on April 17th. The game was, for people that don't know, the game was moved up. It was a Saturday noon spring game. It's going to be Thursday evening, April 17th. I suspect Indiana didn't say, but I suspect that was to accommodate BTN televising it. But I'm curious to see if the fan base behaves like a CFB caliber program on that evening. Like, how excited are they going to be to watch what ends up being a not all that exciting game? But just you can monitor a fan base in those situations where they're almost like irrationally excited, like, let's go to the spring game. But you know what I'm saying? Like, there's nothing really to be excited about, but if your fan base has become so irrationally enthusiastic, they'll show up in droves for that kind of stuff.
It's the same thing as watching the scrimmage at the end of Hoosier Hysteria.
Exactly. It's exactly what it is. So we'll see. We'll see how many people come out for that, and we will also cover all of the media availabilities from the spring. I think there's something like maybe 6, 8, 10 of them over the course of the next month. So we'll have all of that at the Daily Hoosier. Any parting thoughts before we go here?
No.
Right.
Happy March, everyone.
All right. Well, he is Seth Tao. I am Mike Schumann for East 17th Street. We'll catch you all next time.